theirs? Anybody else know they're getting that? A few of you. Do we know if that's gonna be a long thing, or we could just pause for a couple minutes? Are you gonna have to leave the building or anything? I'm not familiar exactly with what all the procedures are gonna be. I thought about trying to reschedule this when I found out, but it seemed okay. Just get at the desks at 10:19. Okay, so maybe at 10:19 we'll just take a little break. Kind of an odd time, but I don't want to drone on. Sure thing. Okay, so we'll go ahead and at 10:19 we'll take a 4 or 5 minute break just to give people a chance to do their drill, and then we'll get back to it. We're nothing if not flexible, right? Seemed easier than trying to get everybody to agree to a new time on 24 hours notice. So, okay. All right then. So without further preamble, my name is Chris Stenson. I am the ORMS administrator for the Oregon State Archives. Some of you are familiar with what we do here, so I'm the gentleman who's in charge of our statewide electronic records management solution. I work closely with Stephanie Clark, who is our state records manager, and she and I sort of share the burdens of these sort of burdens is the wrong word. Share the duties for these sort of training webinars. This is one I've now run for, gosh, I think this might be the third or fourth, maybe the fourth time I've done it. We've seen diminishing attendance as we've gone along. As we'd expect, we got the first big burst out of the way, so we'll probably be taking a break from this one for the next couple months before we offer it again. But it will come up again. So what we're going to be talking about today is, let me get my mouse here. So today we're going to be talking about records management from a communications context. This can involve a number of different technologies that we might use. I use the term modern communications, but the point in this slide, a little tongue-in-cheek, but the idea is that any communication technology that is new can be considered modern at a given time. So the sort of specific things we're talking about now are probably going to be different than what we would be talking about in 10 years maybe or less in some cases in terms of the sort of technologies that might be used then. But the goal here is to sort of set up a framework for thinking about how we deal with new technologies as they are adopted. Specifically for today, we're going to be talking about technologies such as email, of course, is a big one. Instant messaging services that some folks use within the office now, like Slack or Spark. Text messaging, certainly on mobile devices, as well as various mobile messaging apps, Snapchat, WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, iMessage, and all the like, that people have a tendency to do work in, even if they aren't technically supposed to. And we're also going to be talking about social media, which is a quasi-communications technology, I would say. It's more a dissemination mechanism, but of course two-way communication also occurs in these sort of social media environments, so they are worth talking about from that context. So I assume probably most of you have either seen our Records Management 101 session or at least have spoken with us and sort of gotten the basics, so we're not going to belabor that a lot. This is borrowed from that because before we get into talking about how we consider specific technologies as records, it's helpful to think about what we consider a public record in the first place. So first of all, we have a three-part standard that is in the Oregon Public Records Law listed there. So the idea is you can take any given record, whether it's a physical record or a digital record of any sort, and say, and ask these questions and come up with a reasonable answer as to whether or not it would be considered a public record. So first of all, prepared, owned, used, or retained by a public entity relates to an activity, transaction, or function of that group. So you have it, and it has something to do with your work. And it is necessary to satisfy a variety of different requirements, as listed there: fiscal, legal, administrative, historical. That part is usually baked into your schedule. That's the necessary part. That's part of what we go and do that for. So you don't have to make this decision in a vacuum, but this can help. And a key part also is that it is without regard to this technology or medium used to create or communicate that record. So we don't make retention rules based purely upon the technology used to create those records or maintain them. So for example, a message sent via text or sent via email or written down on a piece of paper has the exact same value regardless of what medium it is. So whether it's non-record or not has nothing to do with the format it's in, which I think is a concept a lot of folks understand now, but it was one that a few years back it was still kind of an uphill climb to convince people of that. So we're going to start today talking about email. Email is a modern technology in some ways and a very old technology in others. So email originates as far back as the 1960s in internal technical applications on mainframes. It really started to see wider spread use in the 80s, and by the early 90s, it was the de facto mode of business communication. This is not news to anybody. I think everybody's familiar with. So it's a very mature technology that as yet has very immature frameworks of control around it. So it's sort of grown organically over time. The growth has been exponential, and yet rules for what best practices are for governing email retention have really only in the last decade, especially in the last 5 years, have really started to get fleshed out in a way that is meaningful and useful for folks. So what are our problems when we deal with email? Well, first of all, we have a lot of it. I think this is, no surprise to any of you. We all deal with a ton of emails. We have trouble enough staying on top of our own, and then you multiply that through an entire organization, and it can really get out of hand in a hurry. We create a lot of stuff that we wouldn't have created in the past because handwriting a note takes a lot more work than jotting off a quick email. Making a phone call is quick, but doesn't leave a record behind. So we're creating a bunch of stuff that didn't used to exist in many cases. Often IT policies have been left in charge, IT departments have been left in charge of the email system, so it's based upon their own physical limitations and practical needs that determined how long things were kept, which clearly is an issue with retention rules and the like. It's less a case these days that this is happening unilaterally. I think folks are more aware, but we definitely need to sort of reclaim this area for the records management sphere, or at least in conjunction with IT, because if we leave it to IT alone, they're not the records experts. They're going to do what they need to do, keep things running, and may not always be in compliance with public records law. There are a lot of potential public records in email. I mean, I do 90% of my work via email in terms of my communications, and if none of that was recorded or kept, you'd have no idea what I do. So that's a really important aspect of it. I think most people should understand that these days. Attachments. Sometimes email is simply used as an envelope. So instead of faxing things to each other, which is funny, there's a remarkably large number of faxes still being sent amongst government agencies. I myself am always baffled by the fact that people still choose to use a fax machine over email or something like it, but it's still a thing that exists and still used. But in more and more cases, you're scanning something and emailing it to somebody, so therefore the email itself may not be a record per se. It's just a marker or an envelope, so to speak, but the document attached to it may be the critical bit. Email also presents some significant classification issues. So it can be very challenging to organize email in a way that is both functional and useful down the line, that allows you to get rid of content or in an orderly fashion without violating rules. So that's hard because it's a communication technology that allows for organic conversations, and those have a tendency to flow around and change subjects and combine things in ways that is not easy to then afterwards parse out. So this is what I've been using for a while. I just sort of, in general, and this is a gross exaggeration, of course, you see two types. People tend to trend one of two ways when they deal with email. And it really depends upon their knowledge of the law and how risk averse they are versus trying to get work done. So we have the two broad types, number one being the hoarder. So they like to keep everything they have just in case. They're always concerned about A, not having the thing they need to answer a question 15 years from now, and B, they're scared of potentially deleting anything that might need to be kept so they don't violate rules. The problem with this, of course, is that by just keeping everything, they have a lot of trouble finding the good stuff out with all the junk in there. You've got an overload of capacity. It's straining at the seams, and you really can't efficiently search through things and find what you need. And you're always facing a constant battle with storage capacity. Anybody that works in conjunction with IT can tell you that while people think storage is cheap, when you start dealing with the scale in which they are, I was talking to some folks over at DAS ETS, so the big central agency here that handles a lot of email for many state agencies, and they're talking about 2 terabytes a day of emails just going through their servers and being kept. That's a lot. It's a crazy amount of data. So when you start talking about those levels of data, and then especially when you're keeping things into perpetuity, that can add up in a hurry and really start straining your capacity. Sometimes it's not a limitation of the storage technology, but rather the indexing and the searching. So you have, if I have a petabyte, which is just a crazy amount of data, if I have a petabyte of records, how efficiently can I search through it? How good are the search protocols? Probably not good enough to find what I need at any sort of reasonable time frame. So that's the one kind. Kind number two we have, I call them the Scorched Earth People, and this is fortunately less common than it used to be, but I did used to run across these people more. The idea is that they're going to get rid of everything the second they get it, because then they can, I don't have it, never had it, you can't touch it, I don't need it. Of course, they can't find anything because it's all gone. There's also major violations of public records law involved with this, and for people that have thought, well, if I delete it, nobody can really say I didn't have it. The problem is that your copy is almost certainly not the only copy of this. Every email has a sender and a recipient, and if you say, hey, I never had it, I don't have it, in response to a request, and somebody else can produce that thing, it's really going to be a bad situation for you. So this is hopefully a model we don't see people following anymore, but we have to find a middle ground. Somewhere in the middle between these two folks is what we'd approach a practical path to take. So traditionally, what we would have said would be to sort your emails by content the same way you sort anything else. So what are you talking about in those emails? What record series does that correspond to? And file the stuff with that. Be done with it. The challenge with this, of course, is, as I mentioned, email is a very flexible medium. It allows you to talk in many different ways that may not neatly fit into categories. It may be it can be a very significant filing and sorting burden for people to stay on top of this all the time. Even those of us like me who ostensibly am better prepared to stay on top of my email than anybody else, even I am not great about, you get busy on a day and you get a few days behind. Next thing you know, I have a lot of folders, and trying to sort everything out can be a real pain. So so just saying sort it by content has not proven to be successful. It just has not had good compliance. It just hasn't happened. On the other hand, we don't yet have what I call the magical technology that will allow us to do this without human intervention. So that sort of machine learning, artificial intelligence running algorithms to predict content or to identify content and sort accordingly is technology that sort of exists these days, but it is not super mature. It is not accurate or effective enough yet for widespread use, certainly not in a government context. And it's also pretty cutting edge to the point where those of us in government aren't going to see it anytime soon. It's far too expensive, and it's used more, for example, in the legal fields for e-discovery, things like that. On the discovery and access side than it is on retention side. And I fully expect this technology at some point to finally be ready to go, but we may be a decade out yet. It's one of those frustratingly slow things. So every time people get terrified about artificial intelligence taking things over, the reality is that artificial intelligence is still really terrible about interpreting human conversation. We are just too idiosyncratic. We are too messy for computers to understand us, which is both a positive and a negative, I guess, depending on your feelings about robot uprisings. So barring this magical technology that will save us all at some point in the future, we still have to do something. We need to find a path. So we've learned some things in our years of managing email. First of all, the less sorting we ask people to do, the greater compliance we're likely to see. Like anything, if you ask somebody to sort things by 25 different categories, they're going to struggle to do that. They might find a handful they like and use those over and over again, whether or not it's slightly misapplying, or they might just not do it at all. And that's not good for anybody. So if we give that same person 5 categories, well, that's a lot more manageable. It's much easier to parse that out than if you give them a crazy proliferation. Also, in our capacity as public workers, our email content, our communication content in general, can be predicted as relating to the job functions we fulfill. So you have certain big functions you serve, and as such, one can expect our communications to revolve around those functions. Is this foolproof? No, there's always going to be stray conversations, but we're not worried about making a rule for those oddball items. We're going to try to find rules that will fit the majority of the cases, and then trust us to identify the oddballs and take care of that ourselves. So if we can predict our content, and we want to make people sort less, we can approach a more practical way to deal with email. This is not my idea. I am not a luminary in the field that has come up with a brand new thing and flipped everything on its head, as nice as that would sound. I'm calling this the Stenson Method, and nobody else has thought of this. Nobody at all. In reality, this is a concept that's been floated around. The federal government, the National Archives and Records Administration, issued a bulletin in 2013 that launched what they were calling the capstone process, the capstone initiative, whatever you want to call it. The idea being, specifically for federal agencies, is that they would designate, I realize we're almost to our 10:19, so I'm just going to finish this a little bit and then we'll pause, that they will designate certain levels in federal government agencies to be permanent, and everything below that at some lower level retention, bulk rules based upon broad roles. And this has then seen a lot of traction at the state and local level because we needed something to look at. It's really starting to grow. We're seeing a lot of folks get into it. But taking a pure capstone approach is a little all or nothing. You're saying everything is permanent or it is 6 years, which does not, it does not deal enough with the different varieties of things we might have. So with that, I see it's 10:18. So we're going to pause for a second, do something a little unusual here. Recess for 5 minutes. I will plan on resuming this talk at say 10:24 or so. Call it 6 minutes from now. So give everybody a chance to hide under your desk and everything else. I'll pause this. All right, everybody. Everybody survive? It's quite a thing. I seriously considered just conducting the rest of this thing from under the table here, but the floor's cold and dirty, and I just didn't really feel like it. So my sense of humor only goes so far. All right, everybody's back. I'm going to assume people are back now. I gave it a couple extra minutes. So, right, what were we talking about? We were talking about email. Less exciting than an earthquake drill, perhaps, but we'll make it work. So I was talking about how the feds had launched this capstone initiative to come up with a more creative way to handle email, about how they basically made bulk rules where everything was either permanent or some lower level. So an agency would have either top level personnel would be permanent, and then say everybody else would be 5 years or something like that. The challenge with that is we feel that that does not appropriately encompass the breadth of possible retentions that could be associated with different people's positions. So what we at the archives here, and we aren't the only ones, many other state archives and local institutions across the country have been approaching this, are calling it modified capstone. I know that's really catchy, but we didn't come up with our own clever term for it yet. Where basically we are still going to be basing retentions upon your positions. So an agency would not have 2 retentions. They would still have a variety of retentions for email accounts, but the specific retentions would depend on what it is you do. So a director, a city manager, something like that would probably still be permanent. Your front office administrative assistants would likely be a fairly short period of time. Middle managers and workers that work in different divisions would have retentions based upon the sort of records they deal with. The other part of this is that there are still going to be some cases that don't nicely fit into this. So what we call sort of case file type documents, project files, case files, contracts, personnel folders, the sort of things that don't have nice orderly retentions because they're highly variable depending on the specific life of that thing. We still would be asking people to file that. So what does that mean? Let's explain that a little more. So in order to apply a modified capstone approach, we have 2 basic ingredients. First of all, the job description. So everybody has a position description, and you may or may not do all the things on that, or you may do things beyond that. And so part of this to work is you do need to look at not just the official job description, but all the things you actually do. So if you know you wear hats beyond what your job is, add those to the list essentially. And then we compare that to your approved records retention schedule. So for those of you at a state entity, that's going to be your state agency general schedule as well as your agency special schedule. For those of you at cities or counties or school districts or whatever else, you all have your own schedules for that. So you're going to look at that, and you're going to look at the different types of records that a person does based upon their job description, the sort of things they touch, and you're going to look at that. You're then going to compare the job duties with the schedule items for the things you produce with those job duties. And you're going to look at the longest likely retention. So you're going down the list. You say, oh, here's a 5. Okay, anything longer? Oh, there's a 7. Okay, that's 15. So you're going to look at the longest likely retention based upon that person's job, and that will be the base retention for that email account. So you're going to have a wide variety of retentions based upon the jobs people do. I would note this is not a special retention. It is still based off the schedule. So you are not looking at people and go, I'm going to make all of these people 15 years. Because my question would be, what's that based on? Is there a 15-year retention for a specific record you're referring to? Because if there isn't and you're just guessing a time frame, that's not how we're going. That would be a special retention. That's not what we're doing here. What we are doing is looking at a specific item that would be the longest likely retention associated with that person. So in this case, we're basing it off the schedule. We are going to be over-retaining the rest of the stuff in the account in some cases, and everybody has short-term stuff. But we're doing this for a practical reason. And this does not need special permission from the state archivist. You do not need to file paperwork to allow you to do this, so long as you are pulling off the schedule and are documenting your process. So like anything, we're encouraging folks to, as you look at this and make a decision about what certain positions would be retained for, make sure that you have a notation for that. Make sure you have documentation that shows these are the decisions we made, this is the schedule item we are basing this off of, which will allow you in the future to tweak or modify that, also justify why you're doing it. So it's important to have that cross-link and justify it. Of course, we at the archives are happy to give you advice on this. We just don't enforce this because this is not a forced policy. This is a suggested policy. You are still free to dispose of emails when they're due to earlier. So if you said, if I had a 15-year account and I know well, a lot of this routine office stuff is only 3 years or whatever. And if I wanted to have that disposed of at 3 years like normal, I'm still free to do that. I'm still free to get rid of non-record materials, but I don't have to. If I don't, everything is going to be kept for that 15 years. So we're taking away you don't have to touch every document. It's fairly limited. Some examples of this. So example number one, your agency director or city manager or senior official of some sort. So some of the duties, and this is just something I slapped together, might be directing policy and setting strategy, priorities and institutional focus, approving the budget, communicating with the public and other entities, and approving annual reports. And that comma keeps sneaking into this one. I have two different versions, and I keep forgetting which I fixed, etc. So the schedule items pertaining to this are all over the place. There's loads of them, and the retention is anywhere from nothing to permanent. So in this case, this is going to be a permanent account. They deal with pressing issues that deal with the direction of the agency in question, and as such have a higher value long-term than other folks might. So we're going to make this a permanent retention. Again, not saying that you can't dispose of other things if appropriate. It's just that the base retention for that account will be set at permanent, and then you can identify things that are not as needed or not. Example number two, opposite end of the spectrum, your office receptionist, someone who sits at the front and greets visitors and things like that. So duties might include overseeing sign-in of guests, managing executive schedules, answering phones and opening incoming mail, booking facilities for meetings and coordinating those meetings. The schedule items in question might be room scheduling records, calendar scheduling records, etc. I've listed them out here. I'm not going to read them all out. The retention of those anywhere from 1 to 4 years. And so with 4 years being the longest likely retention, we are going to retain those for 4 years. So relatively short term. People in the middle will be, anywhere in between permanent and that short period of time. I see, yeah, somebody missed a little bit as they just got back. Sorry about that. I will be sending out these slides after the fact, and I'd be happy to have a conversation with you if you have questions about any of it, if it's not defined enough. Okay, so there are exceptions. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. Blanket retention doesn't work well for employee records, contracts, building records, or other variable record series. So unlike a fiscal record or things like that where they're going to fall off based upon the year in which they were created, X number of years after that in an orderly fashion, these sort of records, an employment record or an employee record is going to be tagged to, attached to the length of time that person works for you. If you work with students, the same thing, health files, anything involving people. Contracts, the length of a contract can vary, so the retention trigger won't start until that thing is done. Building records, it's a life of this facility, so that may not happen for many, many decades, and then the clock will start. It's impossible to set a retention on an email account for these sort of series, because otherwise essentially you'd be saying it's permanent, because there's a constant revolving door of things coming into it. There'd be no way to set an appropriate retention on that account. So in that case, we're still going to say your general administrative correspondence still has the base retention. We're still going to establish for your position a base retention based upon your most likely stuff. But for these sort of files, we're still going to ask those individuals to file those separately. The good news, you're already doing that in the paper world. You already have contract files. You already have personnel files, and they may be in digital already. You may have you may be using an electronic records management system. You may have just a shared drive you're filing things in. But in any case, there are already identified places for these sort of records to go. So the actual decision-making process should be easier than if we were asking you to deal with all the administrative correspondence as well, the back and forth of just the day-to-day work. Instead, we say, well, are you having a conversation about that contract? Are you having a conversation about it would go on that person's personnel record, review, employee reviews, things like that? They get filed with that, and then your email account does not have to serve as the repository for that. So that would be how you would identify those. A position like mine, I'm a middle level sort of person. I have many different things I touch. I have a file for every single client agency I work with, which is over 50 at this point, plus all the plus all the prospective ones and everything else. So there's really no way for me to have a base retention for all of those. So I then still have to file those separately. So it's a little bit of burden for some people, but again, I don't have to sweat the general administrative stuff. So some other tips to help you manage email more proactively. First of all, know what you don't have to keep. So anything that is duplicate copy that you are not the primary recipient on and or you are not taking action on, things like FYIs and CCs and informational notices, you do not need to keep that. So HR sends out an email about re-enrollment in your health plan, for example. If we're doing open enrollment right now, and they send out a bunch of notices. Those go out to every single employee. Every single employee does not need to keep that. You use it for whatever you need to, aka to remind you to do something. HR keeps the official copy because they're the ones that generated it and it relates to their job. So remembering that if you are not the active person on something, you're not the record keeper. Ads, listserv messages, event announcements, and spam, of course, all those sort of secondary stuff, all of that can and should be gotten rid of as soon as possible. Personal correspondence, as well as articles and reference materials. Articles and reference materials may have to do with your job. You may have saved one specifically because you were doing research on something, or it was pertinent to your field, but these are not your work products. These are reference copies. So again, if you want to keep them for reference, pull them out, put them somewhere else, but they don't need to live in your email system for long. Also, knowing who is responsible is important. So for internal emails, site to site inside your own agency, the sender is generally the responsible party. That is the active person. So always, are you the person doing something? You're the record keeper. Email from outside source, however, the recipient, whoever's getting this, it's going to be the record keeper. Whether or not this is record content, again, depends on the definition, you know. But assuming this is record content, you are now the record keeper. There are, of course, gray areas. Sometimes you have a lot of back and forth. You're not sure who's keeping it. Feel free to keep the last copy. You know, it's not the end of the world to slightly double up. But generally speaking, you want to stick to that. If people are just sending stuff one directional, make sure you keep it as the sender is the person to keep it. Other things to help run email more efficiently. First of all, purge those deleted items in your that deleted items folder regularly. Now, your IT shop may have a policy or an automatic program that does this. I generally encourage that. I like that to happen. Anywhere from 30 to 90 days is pretty standard. The idea being is that your deleted items folder is still just another folder until it's permanently purged. So it's important that that happens, because once you've said, I'm deleting this, it's not a record, we don't want to hang on to that any longer than we have to. So by all means, make sure there's a policy. If there is no centralized function for that, that's something the employees need to get in practice of doing as well. Making useful specific subject lines can be something that's very helpful to aid in the identification and the search and retrieval of records later by you or by somebody that has to dig through this stuff later to comply with a public records request, for example. You know, you won't be there forever, and think about the work somebody else has to do potentially to dig through this to comply with a search. So using good subject lines, specific. So instead of saying meeting in the subject line, you say follow up to the meeting on October 17th pertaining to records management or something like that. That's going to be a much more specific subject line that gives you multiple points of searchability in there and allows you to quickly browse through emails more effectively. You also only need to keep the last email in a string. So if you're going back and forth to somebody, that can very easily jump into 20-odd emails. You do not need to keep every version of that, because if you keep going up, every newest version contains everything that came before. So we really encourage you to only keep the last message in a string unless you have deliberately chopped out content somewhere in the middle. If you are using Outlook, for those of you that use an Outlook Exchange environment, use the Outlook cleanup tool. From version 2010 forward, they've got this great little button, clean up. You do that for your inbox and for your sent file, and it will condense down and remove all of those redundant copies. It's very reliable. It's also a very conservative tool in that it will not delete anything that is not a true duplicate. So in that example I gave a moment ago, if you had gone in and removed a few back and forth somewhere in the middle, it will keep the last version before that cut and then the most recent version after that cut. So it doesn't lose any content in there. Similarly, if you had a bunch of signature files or disclaimers that stack up at the bottom and you purge some of those out, it will keep the last complete version. So you don't have to worry about this tool accidentally getting rid of any unique content. But it's very effective. It cleans out a lot of bulk. Your guys managing your email system will really thank you for this because it will really cut down on, well, they may not thank you, but they'll feel grateful because it will really cut down on the bulk being stored, which is always an issue on the back end. I used to do this by hand when I was using older versions, and boy, is it a lot nicer to have a tool that does it for me. Oop. Okay, so that's what I got about email. As always, I'm happy to talk to folks about email or how they might apply things, give you advice, share what other people have done. Just reach out to me, and I'm thrilled to talk about it. Social media. So social media presents an interesting challenge for us these days because it is ever more used by government entities to communicate with the public, but it is not a mechanism that we directly control. In most cases, it's a free service that we are piggybacking on, and as such, they don't have to comply with any of our rules. So is social media public record? Well, we go back to our original definition, maybe. Again, does the content meet the public records definition that I gave at the beginning? Is the content unique? Because again, you won't need to keep 12 different versions of the same thing. If you are, for example, putting out a traditional press release and also posting that on your Facebook page and also putting it on Twitter, those are redundant. They are the exact same content as the original, so keep whatever's easiest to you. However, if this is a unique message or you are doing a back and forth with somebody, that's a different animal. The retention will, as always, be based on the content and function of the record. So depends on what you're talking about, depends on what the retention associated with that. There is no blanket social media retention. So what do we need to do to make sure we are being smart about our social media use? Well, first of all, you need written policies and procedures that address the use, access, retention, and ownership of social media content. Now, for example, if you post content on Facebook, Facebook owns that copy of it. They can do anything they want. They can purge it at any time. They can edit it, delete it, whatever, based upon their own algorithms. This happens. So you might say, well, the retention on this stuff's only about a year, like press releases. It's very short. But you cannot count on Facebook, for example, to do that for you. They are a private entity that is not beholden to our rules and are not under contract with you to follow your rules. So as such, you have to make sure you're clear about that. Your policy should dictate, by the ownership I mean, where are you keeping the official copy of this? Where is it being retained? Use and access, so who's got authority to post on your behalf? You know, we've all seen those situations where, you know, an official account of some company or another posts something that clearly is not terribly corporate friendly, and it's usually because some employee that wasn't supposed to get into the account did, or they got their account switched. So being clear about who has access to do what and what you're allowed to do, as well as how you're going to treat retention rules there. You need to have a plan for capturing the content if you're going to be using it for using social media for unique content. Some of these outlets may have built-in mechanisms, such as Twitter will allow you to download your logs, but not all of them do, and some of them kind of do, like Facebook. You can download your stuff, but it throws it all in a bunch of different folders. It's not user-friendly at all. It's not great. So I don't like relying on that. You can also use software to capture it, and there are not a ton of tools, but there are more and more. Examples would be Smarsh, Archive Social. Those are both tools that grab on from the back end as things are posted and capture it into its own interface. Hootsuite would be an example of software that allows you to control multiple social media accounts from the front end. So you would type the post into this software and it would then post on your behalf in the various places, but your definitive copy remains in the originating software. So you control it on the front end that way. There are others out there. I'm not recommending one over another. It's worth looking into, however, if your agency is getting into social media more and more. If you don't rise to that level, or that you can't justify the cost or the effort put into it, you can also compose and control messages locally. There's nothing wrong with crafting a message, saving it on a local file, and then posting that message somewhere else. So you can keep one copy of it as the official and not worry about the one you put out there. Totally permissible. You can also use simple screenshots to capture stuff. There's various ways, you know, so there's ways and there's ways. And if you're a lightly using agency, you might not need to invest much into this at this point. But again, policy is your first thing. Common questions we run across regarding social media. Are you allowed to moderate? Yes, you are. You absolutely are. But you need to document a policy regarding that and follow it consistently. So again, I encourage you to have a moderation policy posted on your header of your page so that members of the public can read it. You want to make sure you are covering yourself. And this isn't so much a records management issue as it is a liability issue, and making sure that you are transparent in your procedures so people don't feel unfairly targeted. And you will probably still have people feel unfairly targeted, but at least you will have evidence to back you up that you're following normal procedures. Because you don't want a situation where in one case somebody posted something that somebody flagged and removed for inflammatory rhetoric or whatever, and then in another case that was virtually identical, it didn't get done because a different person was looking at it and interpreted it differently. You need to make sure you have a blanket policy that is followed consistently to avoid those sort of conflicts. Are comments also records? Maybe. If somebody is just posting, so you post a picture of, I don't know, you post a picture of a festival you had in your town or at your agency, some sort of event. Great. Somebody responds to it and says, oh, that's really cool, or I wish I had been there. That is not important content. That's not a record you need to maintain. However, if they post something as a complaint or a comment that requires response, now you're engaging with them and it becomes a two-way conversation. So if the agency responds or takes action based upon it, if this is somebody reporting a pothole or reporting a crime they think might be happening. That's stuff you're going to want to capture because it's now triggering something you are doing. You're becoming an active participant in it. What about private messages? So if you're using a social media outlet that allows private messages, which most do, those are essentially little email systems in their own software, but again, we don't control them and can't capture them effectively. So it's the same as any other correspondence, but you need to now have the additional burden of trying to capture it. So as much as possible, somebody private messages you, try to encourage them, try to respond via an official email account or forward it on and try to get them to give you that contact information so that you can capture a copy. Otherwise, you need to screenshot it, capture it, move it back somehow so you have a record of that is not simply living on Twitter servers or whatever. So again, making sure you can route that appropriately. But again, if you are using this service and you are allowing yourself to be messaged or allowing comments to be posted, you have to take on the burden of managing those as is appropriate, because you are now saying this is an official government communication source that you can use. So you need to follow through on that. Okay, and I know we're kind of moving right along here, so if you have questions, by all means throw them at me in the chat box or whatever, or I'll follow up with you later if you have a question that needs some research. Mobile devices. So as I post the cheesy joke about the original mobile device. So mobile devices are powerful things that we all use, whether or not we're officially supposed to. Sometimes we're dealing with government controlled devices that have been issued to us, and in many cases we are using our own phones as in the course of business through necessity, one way or the other. So mobile devices are, of course, a dynamic communications platform. They are little computers that can do so many amazing things. And traditionally, in recent history, financial and employee considerations have driven an explosion of bring your own device policies, where people were saying, I don't want to carry the work BlackBerry, which was often the case back in the day, and my own phone. I want one phone. Or the financial services in your agency said, hey, we can save ourselves 15 grand a year if we stop issuing phones and instead let people use their own. So that drove a lot of this, let people use their own phones. Of course, there's been a real backlash on that because there's a challenge controlling that when you're now allowing people to use their own non-government devices to do government work. So, of course, there's records issues. It's an uncontrolled environment for public records. So if you're using your phone to send messages and things like that about your work, you now are privately in control of government information. Which is a challenge for many reasons. Personal and public work tends to get intermingled. So even messier than work email, you've now potentially got personal conversations. How's the kid doing? Oh, here's a picture of my granddaughter. Oh, and by the way, we need to follow up with this interview candidate on the 5th. Voila, we've now crossed the streams, and we're in a challenging place for controlling that. It is also very difficult to capture after the fact, because this content in many cases goes out and it's gone almost as soon as it's sent, or it doesn't live very long, or it only lives on a single device until you've gotten rid of it, which is a problem. So specifically speaking about text messaging and messaging applications, so I've expanded this because traditionally we just say, oh, using text messages, but now people might be using alternate messaging platforms, again, like WhatsApp, or Facebook Messenger or iMessage if you're an iOS user. Those sort of services, again, now we're using a third-party service, but it's still essentially the same sort of mechanism. It's a text message. Who holds them? Well, probably not you. So in all cases, they're going through a Verizon server or an Apple server or wherever that we don't control. You don't control. You have no control over it, no grasp of it. You don't know how long it's going to be kept. It's going to be based upon the company's policies, and they are not required to turn stuff over to you. So I guess is one where a good policy is the essential first step. We recommend having a policy that discourages using mobile messaging for big work-related conversations. The sample phrase I would use would be substantive business-related discussions are not to take place via SMS, that's a short messaging system. SMS, that's text messages. Or other mobile messaging applications. That's just some words I threw out there. It could be anything like that, but that's the general gist. So that right there can help insulate you a little bit. So what's the difference between a substantive conversation and a non-substantive? Well, again, fuzzy gray line area. I would liken it to a non-substantive business conversation or a non-record conversation would be something like, hey, what time are those interviews tomorrow? I'm going to be 5 minutes late. Okay. That's ephemeral short-term information. It's the sort of thing that mobile messaging is good for, updating on time and status, getting an address or whatever. All ancillary content. However, if I say, oh, hey, I want to discuss candidate B. I thought she was very strong in this one area, but she had A, B, and C weaknesses that we need to address before we offer her the job. That now you're talking HR here. Now you're having a specific conversation about somebody, and that is very much a official work record. So that's kind of that distinction. You think about, are we getting into specifics? Are we addressing larger issues? Or are we simply speaking logistics, in which case it's not important? So policy is a starting point. We encourage you to have one or at least lay out what the expectations are. However, policy isn't always enough, and we've had to acknowledge this. You know, this often comes out, and let's see how to be diplomatic about this. Often, well-meaning legislators or those in control at the government level try to make blanket policies to insulate their office or the folks that work for them from dealing with this. The challenge with that is that you can't put the genie back in the bottle. It is impossible, for example, to say you may not use this under any circumstances. That is impossible to enforce. The governor of Maine a few years ago attempted to ban all text messaging by all government workers. I do not believe that has been tremendously successful. So that sort of regressive, you know, we're just going to not use it, blah, blah, get off my lawn sort of policy, that's not good. It's not going to work. So discouraging it in most situations, clearly delineating what appropriate use is or isn't, but also working in some flexibility, knowing if this occurs, you must do X to make sure we're following through. So in some cases it's unavoidable. I've also worked with agencies that deal with, for example, at-risk youths. You're not going to convince a 13-year-old kid who's talking to a government social worker or something like that to send an email. That's ridiculous. They're going to use their phone. They're going to use what they're used to using. So we have to adapt to that. So first of all, there's options. First of all, you can manually forward messages to a government email account. I do this sometimes because I'm pretty careful about not bridging that when I do text messages. However, I do have conversations that sometimes veer. And in those cases, I'm pretty diligent about forwarding them on to my work email account. It's manual, it's clunky, but in ad hoc things, it works. You can also, if this is a more substantive issue that's ongoing, you can set up an auto CC to do messages to send to your email account at the same time. The third option involves software. So there is now a software market called mobile device management. Didn't exist a few years ago, so it's nice to have it, that can allow IT control over parts of devices, whether they are government issued or your own private devices. I'd like to expand upon that a bit. So mobile device management allows for coordinated management of various devices used for work. It can be applied to laptops and tablets as well as phones. Basically, it can do a lot of different things, but ultimately it can provide controlled messaging apps. So for example, I have my own phone. I use my default text messaging service for my own messages. However, work has provided me with a specific application that they can get copies of using a specific messaging app. So everything I send or receive on that messaging app will bounce to the government work servers. That's a good idea. So that's one way that can work. Some of these can also create a partition in your phone where you have a private and a public side of the phone. So the private side of the phone is yours, do your own thing. The public side can be remotely accessed by your IT department. They can remotely wipe it if you get lost. They can do other things, control messaging and all that sort of stuff. It can also sometimes create a virtual number, so you could have two numbers on the same phone, one of which is sort of an internet-based number for your work, and the other would be your own. So again, separating that public and private. This is all workable. So it's cool that this technology exists. We didn't have many options with this a few years ago, and so this is kind of bridging that gap where policy has not totally encompassed what we needed to do. I think we're also seeing if there are more options with this if you're using a government-issued phone, because they have more direct control over it. But even in your own devices, this can function. Okay. So in summation, this is our last little bit here. So in summary, a lot of what we're talking about are specific technologies that we're concerned about right now. But as I mentioned at the beginning, those technologies will continue to evolve. We will not be dealing with the exact same technological problems in 5 years as we are today. Some technologies will pan out and expand, and some will collapse and disappear on us. Email has remarkable staying power, and it's so prevalent that even those saying, oh, email is old hat, we're not using it anymore, a lot of people are still using it and will be for quite some time. So some technologies have a lasting impact, others will come and go. But the key point here is we want to maintain ourselves some flexibility so we can adapt to them by asking a question always, what about the records? So we're going to continue to evolve. We don't know what we're going to be using in the future. I sort of did all my thing without my slide. We don't know what we're going to be using in a decade. We really don't. The records have continually been an afterthought in these. So a lot of it is thinking about appropriate uses of technology. So the first question we should always ask in any new technology, whether it's communication technology or a new database or anything, what about the records? Where will the records live? How will they be managed? Can we get them out? Will this be something we have to worry about for long term? Are they long or short term records? That sort of stuff. You want to think about the appropriate usage, like I said, because just because the new technology seems really cool and people in your agency want to use it, I'm familiar with this phenomenon. We get folks in certain departments that get very excited. Oh, we want to use all these things. Great. Not to be too much of a wet blanket, but we do need to think about what is actually appropriate in a government context and what will work with our infrastructure, so we don't paint ourselves into corners and then have to desperately figure out how we're going to deal with something in 3 years because we didn't plan it out very well. We need to plan for the creation, capture, and retention of records before we're in the thick of it. So the point here is that do your due diligence when you're looking at new things or when you're evaluating existing systems and how they might be retrofitted. Make sure you are planning for all the aspects of records that might live in there before you find yourself in that situation where you're having to scramble because you've got a records request and you realize you can't comply with it and you're facing potential lawsuits and all that sort of stuff. We do not want to be that agency, and there are many examples of this where people have been slow to adapt or sort of had their heads in the sand about whether or not they need to deal with this. Well, sooner or later, we have a very informed public and people are more and more aware of the type of technologies that we are using, and we have to expect that people will ask to see the records being maintained in those technologies. It's just the way it is, and so we just have to make sure we're aware of this. This is a problem best faced head on. I would note also, in summation here, we are expanding our offerings in terms of training here. So I mentioned this particular session will not be offered again next month. We might skip a month or two. I might resume it in January. We'll see what sort of feedback we get. However, recently on October 10th, we had Electronic Records Day, which is a national initiative where governments attempt to bring attention to electronic records and the issues surrounding them. In conjunction with that, I did a webinar that was a national webinar with a colleague from Maryland talking about how to deal with records in existing information systems. So your databases you already have, your HR systems, or when looking to purchase new systems, the sort of questions to ask. So I will be reworking that one, and I'm hoping to make it available via iLearn sometime in November. So stay tuned. You guys are already on the list by being on this, so you'll get notifications of new trainings when they come up. I hope to offer that. I don't yet have a date for that, and depending on the feedback on that, we might do multiple sessions of that one as well. So stay tuned. We're trying to really expand this, but I'm available for any questions you may have. Right now, I'll stick around. You can use the chat box or whatever. Also, if you have questions later, you can contact me directly. I need to update these slides, but those email addresses will work. We now have Oregon.gov email addresses, but the first half is still correct. And if you email this one, it will still work as well. So feel free to shoot any questions you have. If you have schedule-specific questions, Stephanie Clark, our records unit manager, is the better person to talk to about some of those. I can answer them too. It just might take me a little more digging because it's not what I do most of the time. So, but any technology questions, email questions, things like that, I'm happy to entertain. So thanks for everybody being here. I'll stick around for questions. Otherwise, I free you back into the wild. Right, Gail. Do you have a couple minutes? I can go over that stuff again for a moment. Okay, let me just back up a little bit. Anybody still around? Gail asked me a question. She missed a little bit because of the email, the earthquake, the email drill. Yeah, the earthquake drill. So yeah, we'll back up here. I'm just going to go over the email a little bit. So let's see here. You came in. There we go. So this is where I stopped. So Gail, what we were talking about is how we're identifying ways in which we can sort emails proactively based upon the roles people play. So the approach we're looking at here basically is that we are identifying people's roles based upon the position they have, and then we are identifying some other records that might need to be separated out. And how that works is that we are going to look at, for a given person's role, we look at their job description, so the duties they perform, which informs the sort of, and the work products they create, which are the records. And then we compare that to the records retention schedule that you have. So you're going to compare that to the schedule. So you're going to look, what are the duties and what do they create, and what are the retentions associated with those work products. So we're going to go down the list, find the longest, so there's a 5, here's a 6, find the longest likely retention of those records, and we're going to make the entire account that retention. So it's going to be a 15-year account if the longest one we could find, likely one in there, was 15 years. There are likely to be stray things you touch that are beyond that occasionally, and in those situations we just ask that you be smart about it and you identify those and pull them out. But we aren't going to worry about that crazy oddball situation for everything, because that's not what your core function is, and it's, you know, you'd never be able to set anything if you're constantly worried about the what ifs in this case. So we're going to compare those things and come up with retentions based upon positions throughout your organization. I would note this is not a special retention, so you are not looking and saying, well, let's call it 15 years to cover all our bases. No, you're going to look at specific items, because you're going to want to have citations showing how you did the work and what specific retention item you're pulling this off of. So it's not a new retention, because if it was a new retention, you would need special dispensation from the state archivist. And the goal here is you don't need to do that. You do not need permission if you're going off your schedule and just pulling off of that. You will be over-retaining some stuff by this method, but this method does not prevent you from disposing of those other things if you've identified them earlier when they're due to destroy. You don't have to keep everything for that maximum you've established. It's just that that's your baseline, so you've taken the sorting burden off of people. If they don't touch anything, it'll be kept this long. They're still free to identify some things and pull them out as makes sense. I use the example of agency directors deal with a lot of stuff with some pretty long retentions, so they're pretty much all going to be permanent based upon the schedule. Whereas people that do front office duties, for example, on the opposite end of the spectrum, generally speaking, would have records that are very short retention. So in this case, we'd have a 4-year retention, because the sort of records this person covers, touches, do not rise above that. We also noted that there is an exception that in some cases, it's very you have too many revolving things. So people that work personnel files or contracts, for example, highly variable record series that are constantly pushing out, and you'd basically have to make those accounts permanent if you were going to follow the same rule. So in those cases, you're still going to have set up base retention based upon their general administrative correspondence, most of the stuff they do, but certain series like contracts or HR, personnel files will need to be identified and pulled out. But you already have files for that. You're already used to doing that. So that's a relatively light thing, and it's a lot easier to identify a conversation about a contract, specifically a contract, than to identify the retention of a miscellaneous conversation about various office work and the things you're doing and the coordination of this and that sort of thing. So that's really the additional burden that it falls in those sorts of situations. We do still ask that those get pulled out, but by dealing with that base retention, even in those situations, they're probably going to have 70 to 80% of their stuff just taken care of. They don't have to worry about it so much, and just identify those things that are not to help cover that. I think this is about where you came in last time, right? You were here for the tips afterwards, right? Always fun having a conversation when I'm talking and somebody else is typing. Still with me, Gail? There you are. Okay, cool. Yeah, I'm going to send out the slides. I'll send out the slides to everybody on the list. So, and if you have follow-up questions, no problem. Just shoot me an email or give me a call. All right, if there's nothing else, I don't think I saw any other questions pop up. I'm gonna go now. So thanks everybody.